For more than a decade now, if you've been in the Resident Evil fandom, you've heard the story about Resident Evil 5. It's pretty simple, right? RE5 was the beginning of the end, the exact moment the series ditched the terrifying, butt-cheek-clenching survival horror for loud, adrenaline-pumping blockbuster action. But here's the thing, that story isn't quite right and never sat well with me as a fan. Resident Evil 5 wasn't just some dumb action game. It was a crucible. It pushed the series' formula at the time to its absolute breaking point, and in doing that, it accidentally laid the groundwork for everything that came next. From the train wreck that was its sequel to the grotesque return to true survival horror. So today, we're not just taking a nostalgic trip back to Resident Evil 5, we're digging up its true, undeniable legacy as one of the most important and maybe most misunderstood chapters in the Resident Evil franchise.
Resident Evil 5.
To really get Resident Evil 5, we have to understand the world it shambled out into. The year is 2009. The PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 are in full swing. The video games are getting bigger, louder, and way more cinematic. But most importantly, the year is 2009, which means it's been 4 years since 2005. The year Resident Evil 4 literally changed the gaming landscape. Resident Evil 4 wasn't just another game, it was a full-blown gaming revolution. It took the fixed camera angles, tank controls, and slow methodical pace of the old school games, tore it all down, and rebuilt the whole thing from the ground up into the tyrant it would become. The over-the-shoulder view, the killer combat, the perfect mix of action and tension, it created a whole new gameplay language for third-person shooters. It was, and very much still is, considered one of the greatest games ever made. So, how do you follow that up? How do you make a sequel to a game that was already praised to be nearly perfect? That was the impossible task staring Capcom right in the face, like a monstrous creation come back to torment its creator. The expectations from everyone were stratospheric. Fans wanted more of the game they just fell in love with, but they also wanted to be surprised. They wanted horror, but they also wanted that adrenaline rush that RE4 was so good at delivering. And Capcom, well, they seem to have a clear plan. Go bigger, go better, and go more. More action, more enemies, and for the first time in a main game, a full campaign built from the ground up for two-player co-op. And the marketing was just as bombastic as the gameplay. The trailers showed a sun-blasted, war-torn country, a huge change from the gothic, gloomy vibes of Spain that we just saw in RE4. This wasn't a game about creeping through spooky hallways anymore. Those narrow hallways have now been traded out for slightly less narrow streets and alleys. This was open warfare against hordes of smart, aggressive bioweapons. It was Resident Evil trying to muscle its way into the modern era, quite literally. Ready to go toe-to-toe with the giants of the time like Gears of War and Call of Duty. But in chasing that blockbuster dream, in stepping out of Resident Evil 4's shadow and into that blinding African sun, Resident Evil 5 created a whole new shadow of its own, one that would loom over the series for years to come. It promised and delivered series evolution, but in many aspects, RE5 felt like a de-evolution. RE5 was praised for progressing the action combat and inclusion of a very well done co-op system, but got slammed for devolving way too far from its survival horror roots.
Help me!
At its nucleus, Resident Evil 5 is a game at war with itself. It has one foot planted deep in the action-heavy world of RE4 and other contemporaries of the time, and the other foot is desperately trying not to rot off and slip out of the survival horror soil that it grew from. The result is this massive identity crisis that you can feel throughout many aspects of the experience. On one hand, the game is a straight-up action horror powerhouse. You're mowing down hordes of infected Magini, blasting through explosive set pieces, and fighting building-sized mutated biohazard bosses. But on the other hand, it holds on to these mechanics and design ideas that were made to make you feel weak compared to your enemy. RE5's tank movement controls and the inability to move while shooting forces you to plant your feet and make sure that every single shot counts. It creates this very specific kind of tension. You feel like a sitting duck with an RPG. It's a design choice straight from RE4 that makes every fight this deliberate dance of positioning, crowd control, and managing your resources. And that resource management is where the game's survival horror DNA really kicks in. Long gone is RE4's roomy attaché case. Now you're stuck with a 9-slot inventory grid, 18 if you include your partner slots, that feels like it was ripped right out of the classic games. This means every bullet, every herb, every grenade, every single item has to earn its spot. And this works using a real-time inventory management system. There's no pausing the action to calmly sort your items and heal up. If you need to reload or mix some herbs, you have to do it in real time while a horde of Magini is charging at you. This one design choice injects this frantic, desperate energy into every firefight, creating a kind of pressure that even RE4 didn't hit very often. It's this brilliant mix of old school limits and new school action that forces you to think like a survivor even when you're armed like a soldier. But this identity crisis was only half the story. The other half was a huge controversy that blew up before the game was even out. The decision to set the game in a fictional African nation, Kijuju, and have a white protagonist, Chris Boulder Muscles Redfield, fighting hordes of infected black locals, it sparked a huge and immediate debate. The very first trailers were criticized for their imagery, with some critics pointing out that the visuals brought up some really harmful colonial-era tropes of a dark continent and a white savior. Critics argue that the game had no positive black representation and that the design of some enemies, like the tribal Nidipaya, felt like they were based on outdated and insensitive stereotypes. Capcom at the time was reportedly caught completely off guard by this, saying they just wanted to find a new exotic place for their bioterror story to happen. They later introduced Sheva Alomar, a black BSA agent from Africa who is Chris's partner and guide for the whole game. Now, while some people incorrectly claimed she was just added because of the controversy, her role as a core co-op partner was actually planned way earlier. The British Board of Film Classification, the BBFC, eventually looked into the claims and backlash, finding no evidence of racism, but the debate never really died. In fact, in the last few years, as the industry has gotten more aware of representation, articles in 2023 and 2024 have brought the whole discussion back up, with a lot of people thinking the game's racial portrayals would make a modern remake incredibly difficult, if not completely impossible, without some major changes. Unfortunately, this controversy is now just a part of what Resident Evil 5 is, and a reminder that with art, context, and how you represent things matter just as much as what you intended. And I'm sure for those of you watching that have the context of actually having played Resident Evil 5, that you, like me, would like to see Capcom give RE5 the RE2 remake treatment.
Come on!
For all the talk about its identity and its controversies, the conversation around Resident Evil 5 usually misses one crucial thing. The gameplay design, in a lot of ways, is exceptional. Buried under all the blockbuster explosions and the polarizing story is a masterclass in co-op action design, a system so good and so influential that you can still feel its echoes in the series today. The game's single greatest achievement is its co-op synergy. This is not just a single-player game with a second character thrown in. Every single system is built around partnership. That tiny 9-slot inventory isn't just a callback to the classics. It's a strategic puzzle for two people to solve together. Who's carrying the extra ammo? Who's holding the key items? Who's using the shotgun? Who's got the sniper rifle? These are questions you're constantly asking, forcing you to communicate and work as a team. And this idea infects every aspect of gameplay. The shared healing, where using a first aid spray heals both of you if you're close, makes you want to stick together. The ability to trade items in real time lets you save your partner in the middle of a fight, passing them a critical clip of ammo or a life-saving herb. The levels are often even designed with optional splits or sometimes forced splits, forcing you to cover each other from different angles and spots and to work together to flank tough enemies. This creates what some have called a trust dilemma. Every single thing you do to help your partner directly helps you too, creating this really organic and rewarding loop of mutual survival. Even something as simple as the laser sights on your guns becomes a way to communicate without talking, letting you point out enemies, items, and weak spots for your partner. The second thing that makes the design so good is the combat flow itself. Yeah, not being able to move and shoot feels clunky at first, but it allows for this beautiful symmetry between shooting and melee attacks. Staggering an enemy with a perfect shot to the leg or head opens them up for a powerful melee follow-up, and these attacks aren't just for looks, they're essential for crowd control and saving ammo. A good, well-timed punch can send a whole group of enemies flying, giving you a few precious seconds to reload or move to a better location. This creates this constant risk-reward dynamic that's always engaging. Do you play it safe with body shots, or do you risk getting close for a headshot that could lead to a devastating melee combo? This whole system, which some have even compared to the style switching in games like Devil May Cry, makes RE5's combat feel more fluid and dynamic than even RE4's in a lot of ways. When you mix this deep co-op system with the high-stakes combat and the relentless enemies, you get a game that is mechanically demanding in the best possible way. Playing on the higher difficulty, where you're starved for resources and one hit can kill you from some enemies, completely transforms the game. It stops being just an action game and turns into a brutal, tactical, cooperative survival experience. And let's be honest, the frustration a lot of us felt with Sheva's AI in single player is just proof of how important a good human partner is to this game's design. With a friend, the game isn't just tolerable, it is one of the most well-designed and flat-out fun co-op experiences of its entire generation. Now, it's pretty clear that playing Resident Evil 5 is a totally different experience depending on if you're playing solo or with a buddy, and that's where I want to hear from you guys. What was your first time playing RE5 like? Did you brave it alone with the AI partner, or did you team up with a friend? Let me know down in the comments, because I have a feeling the stories are going to be very, very different, and maybe even a little horrifying. The legacy of a game isn't just about how good it was when it came out, it's about the ripples it sends through the industry and, more importantly, through its own franchise. The ripples from Resident Evil 5 were basically tidal waves. For better or for worse, it became the architect of the entire next era of Resident Evil. The most immediate and obvious result was Resident Evil 6. If RE5 was a game having an identity crisis, RE6 was the game that fully embraced the action side of that crisis and then cranked the dial to an absolutely absurd level. RE6 took the co-op, the crazy set pieces, and the global bioterror plot from RE5 and just multiplied it exponentially across 4 different campaigns. The result was this bloated, unfocused mess that for a lot of fans was the final straw. That careful balance of action and tension that RE5 had struggled with was just gone, replaced by non-stop explosions, vehicle sections, Call of Duty-like UI, and QuickTime events. While RE5 held on to some survival horror with its restrictive controls and inventory management, RE6 threw almost all of it out of the window for pure Michael Bay-style spectacle. The backlash against RE6 was so huge that it directly led to a massive course correction for the whole series. So in a weird way, the failure of RE6 is a direct part of RE5's legacy. It was the inevitable, explosive end of the path that RE5 started running down. But the influence wasn't all bad. At the same time, Capcom was playing around with a different formula in the Resident Evil Revelations spin-offs. The first Revelations, which came out on the 3DS, felt like a direct answer to the criticism of RE5. It brought back the claustrophobic hallways and a bigger focus on horror, but it didn't just throw away the action mechanics. It found a nice middle ground mixing the over-the-shoulder gameplay with a more classic sense of dread. Revelations 2 leaned even harder into the lessons from RE5, creating an asymmetric co-op experience where one player did most of the fighting while the other provided support. It was a clear evolution of the co-op ideas and designs that RE5 had introduced, but used in a more horror-focused way. The Revelations games proved that this action-horror hybrid could work, it just needed the right balance and further refinement. This all leads to the biggest ripple of all, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. RE7 was a radical reinvention, a full-on return to survival horror that felt like a direct apology for the action era.
Be careful. They'll be looking for you.
Daddy's coming. We need to go.
Still wanting to evolve the series, RE7 switched to a first-person camera, but called back to the series' survival horror roots by trapping you in one terrifying, maze-like rural house. Capcom was very clearly trying to get as far away as possible from the globe-trotting action of RE5 and RE6, but the success of RE7 didn't erase the legacy of those action games. Its sequel, Resident Evil Village, proved it. Village was a brilliant mix of the entire series up to that point. It had the first-person horror of RE7, the inventory and merchant from RE4, and the explosive horde mode action straight out of RE5. The entire last chunk of that game, where you play as Chris Redfield mowing down werewolves, feels like a modern version of RE5's core gameplay loop. It showed that the action DNA from RE5 was still a vital part of the series and a tool that could be used when the story called for it.
Resident Evil 5.
So, what is the real legacy of Resident Evil 5? For years, it was branded a disappointment, the game that picked action over horror and started the series' decline. But looking back at it now, that story just doesn't feel right. Resident Evil 5 was a hinge point. It was a game full of contradictions, a survival horror game dressed up like an action blockbuster shooter, a tightly designed co-op game crippled by its single-player AI, and a technical masterpiece that got stuck in controversy before it even released. It wasn't a perfect game, not by any stretch of the imagination. Not by a long shot. Its story was campy, its AI was infuriating, and its identity was all over the place. But its flaws are just as important as its strengths. The backlash to its action-heavy style directly led to the horror comeback of RE7. The over-the-top story gave us the legendary boulder-punching Chris Redfield, a moment of beautiful absurdity that's now an iconic part of the series' charm. And its brilliant co-op mechanics built a foundation that influenced the Revelations games and even found its way back into the main series. Resident Evil 5 tested the limits of what a Resident Evil game could even be. It pushed the action so far that the series almost broke, forcing Capcom to go back and rediscover its horror roots. But by doing that, it also created a new set of tools, a new style of gameplay that the franchise still pulls from today. It proved that Resident Evil could be more than just one thing. It could be tense, slow burn horror, and it could be explosive co-op action. The modern series, from the remakes to Village and even the more recent Resident Evil Requiem, lives on that exact duality, perfectly blending the terror of the old with the action of the new. It wasn't the beginning of the end, it was the end of the beginning. It closed the book on the classic era, and through all its successes and all its failures, became the unwilling architect of modern Resident Evil. For better or worse, Resident Evil 5's legacy isn't one of failure, but of foundational change. A legacy of pushing to the breaking point to achieve evolution. And that brings us to the end of the video, my dudes. So as always, like the video if you liked the video, dislike it if you didn't, and subscribe either way. Doing all that YouTube jazz helps me out tremendously, and as always is greatly appreciated. And while you're at it, if you could, try out that new hype feature and share the video to a friend of yours who's a Resident Evil fan and might find it interesting. But honestly, regardless of any of that, thank you so much for watching until the very end. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a cool-a-rooney rest of your day.
Cool-a-rooney.